So this is a top 5 list that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Top 5 movie soundtracks. I've mentioned in previous episodes of this podcast that growing up, being a fan of movies, something that would always get me excited about it was the poster. It would tell you just a snippet of what the movie was about, and it would really build anticipation for eventually wanting to see this film, like Ghostbusters, or, in my case, a movie like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I can remember the poster for The Lion King. But we're not here to talk about posters. We're here to talk about the other thing that gets me amped for a movie, and that is the soundtrack. I remember as a teenager, I collected movie soundtracks to those that, I was really excited to see, because a soundtrack can really capture the spirit of a movie. And those that may not know the difference between a soundtrack and a soundtrack is a compilation of music that is chosen to, kind of fit the mood of the movie, that might fit in with the theme or the genre or the style. A score is music that is written and composed to put throughout the movie. So a score would be like Star Wars or Interstellar or Dunkirk. Movies like that, or Lord of the Rings. Those are scores, with your violins, your orchestra instruments, essentially. But scores is such a huge part of movies that I feel like it warrants its own list. So I wanted to keep this soundtrack specific. There are some that submitted their list that did include scores. I'm still going to read them, but I wanted to explain the difference between a soundtrack and a score before we get started. If you've never done an episode of my show that's top 5 themed, or you've never participated, here's how it works. I put out a post on social media saying this month I'm going to do, in this case, top 5 movie soundtracks. Leave your list in the comments, and I will read them on the show. I'm going to go through my list and why I've ranked them where they are, and then I'm going to read your list after that. So starting in at my number 5 is arguably my favorite comedy of all time, and that would be The Big Lebowski, starring Jeff Bridges and John Goodman, of course, John Turturro, and many others, Steve Buscemi. I saw this movie for the first time when I was in my early 20s, and I was drawn to the soundtrack just as much as I was the actual movie, because it had a lot of music that I grew up with. I grew up with classic rock, southern rock, 80s music. So this soundtrack really spoke to me, with the use of Creedence Clearwater Revival, and that even being mentioned, that specific band in the movie. The Kenny Rogers song, I just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in, is a song that still pops up in my head every now and then, and I can't help but sing along with it. I'm not going to do that on this show because I don't want to lose my audience, but yeah, I love the Big Lebowski soundtrack. It captures that feel of the movie, and it's got a decent genre variety too. My number 4, this might surprise some people, but Daredevil. Not the Netflix series, but the Ben Affleck movie that came out in 2003. And I say that because not only did it capture the feel of the movie, it also captured that era, the early 2000s, quite well. I remember the soundtrack being a big deal when it came out because it included the song Bring Me to Life by Evanescence, that you couldn't go 30 minutes if you were listening to traditional radio. You couldn't go 30 minutes without hearing this song on a rock station. It also had music from The Calling, Nickelback. I know a lot of people don't like Nickelback, but they were still a big part of that time frame of music. Saliva, it really captured the early 2000s, and it takes me back to being a teenager, because I was a junior in high school at that time. It was a time where I was really starting to think about, well, I've only got a year of high school left, so what am I going to do? And it takes me back to that time. And I'm sure, people that grew up in the 70s or the 80s, they have their soundtracks that give them that same type of feel. So Daredevil has that feel for me. So it comes in at my number 4. My number 3 is Guardians of the Galaxy. This is a soundtrack that I've used this comparison. I think it is arguably its own character because it plays such an important part of the movie, because Peter Quill has his Walkman with the Awesome Mix Volume 1 tape, and it plays so well, even though it's a sci-fi movie set pretty much entirely in space. It gives me a nice feel to those fun, like 80s sci-fi movies with their soundtracks. And it brings me back to the music that I grew up with. I know that all of the music is before my time, but I grew up around it. That's what my parents listened to. So everything, like, it has a song for every particular kind of moment, from romance to action to fun to drama. You want it, the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack has it. And I remember the soundtrack was as big of a hit as the movie when it came out. My number 2 is Back to the Future, of course, the iconic Michael J. Fox film that was released in 1985. There's not much time that goes by that I don't at least listen to a couple of songs from the soundtrack. I still have the CD that I bought when I was a teenager. I know the movie predates CDs, but CDs were more of my time. But I remember watching the movie when it came out on DVD, and it was the first time I had seen it in a long, long time. And I fell in love again with the soundtrack because, as I mentioned, 80s music was a big part of my childhood. So I was drawn to the songs like The Power of Love, Back in Time, Heaven is One Step Away, Time Bomb Town, even Earth Angel. Those were songs that, like, that is one of the few soundtracks that I can listen to without skipping a song. But the reason why it's not my number 1 is because it is one that I can listen to constantly and not skip a single song. And that, without a shadow of a doubt, when I came up with this list, it was easily my number 1, and that is Top Gun. Of course, Tom Cruise juggernaut that was released in 1986, ironically the year I was born. You've got Kenny Loggins, Cheap Trick, Berlin's Take My Breath Away. You've got great songs like Destination Unknown, Playing with the Boys. I know it's a Kenny Loggins song, I already mentioned him, but so many songs are iconic in this movie. And I don't think it would be the same. It would still be a good movie, but I don't think that it would be as iconic if you didn't have that opening with Danger Zone, and the score's great too. But the selection of music that you've got, and of course, Great Balls of Fire by Jerry Lee Lewis, you don't have to skip any song at all in this soundtrack. Take My Breath Away was an iconic love theme from the late 80s. It's got something for everybody, and I love it. It's, in my opinion, the greatest movie soundtrack ever made. There's ones that you can make the argument for, but I'm going to say that Top Gun is my number 1 and what I consider to be the best movie soundtrack of all time. So that is my list. I didn't have any honorable mentions. I wanted to kind of keep it, tight and concise, because we did get quite a few lists here that we're going to get into right now. First up, we have Eddie Murray, who is one of my former coworkers from the Pensacola Blue Wahoos. He just has one, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. I don't remember much about that movie. It's one that I should probably revisit, and I wasn't expecting to see it make any appearance on this list, but that's pretty cool. Tommy Ryan, Braveheart, Oblivion, Mortal Kombat, the first one, The Wedding Singer, and Pulp Fiction. If I had done honorable mentions, Pulp Fiction would have been on there. And if this were a top 10, it probably would have been 6 or 7. Everything from the surf guitar to Kool and the Gang, it's so fun. And I love that movie so much. It's so good. The Wedding Singer, of course, is a great soundtrack too. It's one of the most popular. And you're going to see it more than once again on these various lists. And Mortal Kombat, who doesn't know the Mortal Kombat theme song? Lawrence Strickland, Walk the Line, Grease, This Is It, a Michael Jordan documentary, The Wedding Singer, and Pulp Fiction. Grease is another fun one too. I saw that movie numerous times as a kid. Everything from Grease Lightning to Hopelessly Devoted to You. It's a fantastic soundtrack. I love it. Wade Vatican, frequent top 5 contributor here on the podcast. Number 5, Pulp Fiction. Number 4, Forrest Gump. That's another great one. 3, Grease. 2, Empire Records. And number 1, Dazed and Confused. Just gotta keep on living, man. Livin. Dazed and Confused it's another soundtrack that I think perfectly captures the spirit of the time frame that it takes place in. Jonathan McIntosh, his number 5 is Back to the Future, aka Power of Love album. We talked about that earlier. Forrest Gump, Dirty Dancing, Grease, and Queen's It's a Kind of Magic Highlander album. I wasn't expecting to hear that one, but here we are. I like that choice. Next up, we have Kara Cassidy Thomas. Number 5, Drive Me Crazy. Number 4, Dirty Dancing. 3, Grease. 2, Tarzan. We were actually talking about this. I think Tarzan is, if it's not the best, it's in the top 2 or 3 albums with Phil Collins's finest work. I love the Phil Collins music in Tarzan. And number 1, The Wedding Singer. I told you were going to hear it again. Chris Davis, number 5, the original Top Gun. 4, Forrest Gump. 3, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That is such a great soundtrack. Again, I could sing it, but I don't want to alienate people, so I won't. But go out of your way to listen to that soundtrack. It's really good. Number 2, Eddie and the Cruisers. And number 1, Guardians of the Galaxy. Steve Wise. Soundtrack of songs is tricky. You have musicals and then needle drops. Of the latter category, there are movies that use songs to tell the story by using period-specific songs, ones that comment on the action or theme, or diegetic music. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And then others just try to cram what they hope are hit songs into the film in order to sell an album. Of course, I prefer filmmakers using songs to tell the story rather than just trying to be capitalistic. Given that, here are some non-musical selections that come to mind. Stand By Me, that's a great one. Forrest Gump, Contact, Back to the Future, and American Graffiti. American Graffiti is a great one too. Wally Phelps, Mortal Kombat, The Crow. I actually just recently rewatched The Crow for the first time in a couple of years, and yeah, that soundtrack is so good. Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, and Queen of the Damned. Chris Kubiak, The Crow, The Matrix, another great soundtrack that encapsulates the late 90s. Forrest Gump, only soundtrack that I can recall that was a double volume. Guardians of the Galaxy, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. That's another great one too. Honorable mentions that could be swapped with at least 2 of my picks. Berry Gordy's The Last Dragon, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Airheads, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Crow, City of Angels, Above the Rim, Belly, and I can't believe I didn't think of this one either, The Fast and the Furious. It's if you grew up in the early 2000s, that was a movie that you had to see, and you knew at least one or two of the songs from that movie, because it encapsulates a lot of the, I'm using that word a lot this episode, but it's a good word, encapsulates. It captures the time frame and that culture of the drag racing from the early 2000s. And if I spent an hour, I could probably cultivate a few more. I don't believe in rules. 5, like music can be contained like that. I don't disagree with that, my friend. Jason Robbins, Pulp Fiction, my all-time favorite soundtrack. I had to get 2 copies back in the 90s because I wore the first one out. Reservoir Dogs. I love that the DJ, comedian Stephen Wright, made the whole soundtrack feel like a radio station. The Crow, the pinnacle of 90s awesomeness. Star Wars Trilogy box set. I still have this box set to this day. Pre-special edition, so no Jedi Rocks foolishness, and had the original Ewok celebration at the end of Jedi on it. Yub Nub, never forget. Batman Forever, another soundtrack I had 2 copies of because I wore the first one out. Kick anyone who doesn't like Kiss from a Rose out of your life because you don't need that kind of negativity. That soundtrack was the soundtrack of my life for about a year straight. So, a funny story about the Batman Forever soundtrack. I love that soundtrack as well. Batman Forever was the first Batman movie that I can remember seeing advertisements for and being like, I have to see this movie. You know, I had seen Batman Returns and Batman 89 before that, but I didn't grow up with those. Yeah, I was very young when they came out, but I don't really remember that much about them at the time of their release. But I do with Batman Forever because everybody was doing some kind of Batman Forever tie-in with their products or marketing, and the soundtrack was so good. Everything from Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me by U2, and of course Kiss from a Rose. And that actually became a running gag of mine when I worked at the Blue Wahoos. Whenever I would run sound, the last song I would play before we'd shut, the press box down was Kiss from a Rose. And one night when I was leaving the stadium, our groundskeeper asked me, so why do you always play that song after whenever you're leaving? And my immediate thought was, well, why not? I mean, who doesn't like Kiss from a Rose? And it's a song that I can still listen to today, and it still makes me smile. But yeah, that soundtrack is awesome, and that's a really good list. Alex Hyde White, he just has one, Last of the Mohicans. Chris Manson, Once Upon a Time in the West. The Social Network, of course, composed by Trent Reznor. Fast Times at Ridgemont High. The Harder They Come, and Mad Magazine presents Up the Academy. Thanks for the topic. You're welcome, Chris. Carly Previtt, Birds of Prey, Atomic Blonde, Cruella, I, Tonya, and if I could put a mini-series down, the Lizzie Borden Chronicles. If musical soundtracks count, then Tarzan and Chicago. Chicago was a great, great soundtrack. I love the opening for that movie. Mike Inslee, Pump Up the Volume, Phantom of the Paradise, Rocky Horror Picture Show, that would have been an honorable mention for me as well, and The Wedding Singer. Nick Smith, Blade Runner, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, Aliens, Star Wars, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I apologize if I get your name wrong, but Madalena Ostrowski, Purple Rain, that's a good one too, Back to the Future, and Dirty Dancing. What a fee! I'm not going to do it, I'm sorry. AJ Caruso, Jackie Brown, Boogie Nights, Pulp Fiction, Saturday Night Fever. If you're a fan of 70s disco, and especially the Bee Gees, you'll love that. That was a soundtrack that I grew up with. And Forrest Gump, and he notes also a top movie score. Greg Parker, The Highlander, Star Wars, Guardians of the Galaxy, Rocky Horror, and Bohemian Rhapsody. And finally, we have Mr. Michael Perkinson. He just has one entry, The Big Lebowski. I love that choice because, as you heard, it was in my top 5. That's going to do it for the list, my and your list for top 5 movie soundtracks. Thank you to everyone who made your submissions. Again, be on the lookout for future posts on social media at D Diamond Podcast for future installments.